Three young women stand before a crack in a granite wall so narrow it barely admits a person sideways. The oldest presses her palm flat against the stone. Behind them, nothing. A dead trail, a cold sky, no living soul who knows where they are. Before them, darkness, and the faint, impossible smell of pine smoke. Ruth Vance was 9 years old the first time her father told her that the best shelter a person can have is one nobody else knows about. She had thought he meant it the way grown men sometimes talked, big and vague and meaning nothing. She filed it away the way a child files away things that don't quite make sense yet. She would not understand it for 11 years. She would not understand it until she was standing at that wall. The town of Elk Hollow sat in a crease of the Idaho Territory mountains, the kind of place that existed because the ground around it was worth something, and the people who arrived first stayed because leaving felt like admitting failure. The Vances had lived on its edge for 12 years. Not quite in it, not quite out of it. Jonas Vance worked timber and traded when he could. His wife, Margaret, kept a garden so productive that women twice her age came to ask what she put in the soil. They were respected in the cautious way frontier people respect someone they don't entirely understand. Ruth had grown up knowing how to do things. She could mend a harness, calculate board feet, read weather in the color of morning clouds. At 20, she was the one the younger two looked to when the world tilted, which it had been doing, steadily, for 2 years. First her mother, taken by a fever in the winter of 1887. Then her father, a year and a half later, a fall from a hillside he had walked 100 times. Cora was 18 and had their mother's careful eyes. She noticed things before they needed to be noticed. A loose hinge, a change in a neighbor's expression, a number that didn't add up. She kept a small journal, wrote in it every night, and rarely showed anyone what was inside. Nell was 16 and still wore her feelings on her face in a way the older two had learned to hide. She was the one most likely to reach out and touch something beautiful or strange. Most likely to ask the question nobody else had thought to ask. After their father died, she had cried openly and without apology. Ruth had envied her for it. The house they had rented in Elk Hollow belonged to a man named Aldous Peck, who made it understood within 2 weeks of Jonas Vance's burial that he wanted it back by the end of the month. He was not cruel about it. He was simply practical in the way that costs other people everything. The letter came from the bottom of their father's trunk, sealed with candle wax and addressed in his careful handwriting to Ruth, Cora, and Nell. When the time comes. Ruth broke the seal at the kitchen table with her sisters on either side of her. The letter was 3 pages. The first page was their father telling them he loved them in the plain-spoken way he had always done, without decoration, without apology. The second page was practical, a small amount of money left with a man at the land office, enough to outfit them for travel. The third page was directions, distances, landmarks, a hand-drawn map of a trail that left the main road 7 miles north of town and climbed into the granite ridges above the tree line. At the bottom, he had written, "I made you something. Go find it." Cora read the letter twice, then sat back in her chair and looked at the map. "He drew this himself," she said. "Look at the detail. He knew exactly where he was going." "He went up there a lot," Nell said. "Remember? He'd be gone 2-3 days sometimes. He always said he was checking the timber." Ruth remembered. She had not questioned it because her father was a man who moved through the world with quiet purpose, and she had trusted that purpose. Now she felt the particular ache of realizing that trust had been warranted in a direction she hadn't expected. "We have nowhere else," she said finally. That was true in the plainest way. Aldous Peck had given them until the 1st of the month. They had no relatives close enough to help. The other families in Elk Hollow were not unkind, but they had their own difficulties and their own mouths to feed. Ruth had already seen the particular expression on a neighbor's face that meant, "I wish I could do more," and also meant, "I won't." Cora spread the map on the table. 7 miles north, then a left at a granite pillar he's marked here. Then 2 more miles up. He says the trail disappears, but to keep going northeast. She looked up. He says we'll know the wall when we see it. What if it's nothing? Nell asked. What if it's just a place he liked? Then we'll have gone for a walk, Ruth said. With everything we own on our backs, Cora said, but not bitterly. She was already calculating. The real debate was quieter than words. Ruth lay awake that first night and looked at the ceiling and thought about what it meant to follow a dead man's directions into the mountains with 2 younger sisters in her care. She thought about what it meant to trust someone after they were gone. She thought about Aldous Peck's flat expression when he'd told them his timeline, and about the way the town had already begun to look at them differently. 3 young women alone, untethered, a problem that needed solving by someone else's hand. By morning, she had decided. They would go. They would see what their father had made. They packed for 3 days and left before dawn on a Tuesday, while the town was still quiet. Ruth carried the frame pack with the tools and dry goods. Cora carried the bedrolls and their father's letter, folded inside her journal. Nell carried the seed packet their mother had kept in a tin box on the kitchen shelf. She had taken it without asking anyone, and neither of her sisters said a word about it when they saw it in her hands. The road north was empty. The mountains ahead were dark against a sky that had not yet decided what color it wanted to be. They walked into it without looking back. 2 miles into the climb, Nell found a piece of lumber wedged in the roots of a pine tree, old, weathered, but cut with a saw, not broken. Cora crouched beside it and turned it over. On the underside, in faded pencil, were 2 letters, J. V. Jonas Vance. Neither sister spoke for a moment. Then Nell pressed her hand over the letters the way she sometimes pressed her hand over something she wanted to memorize. He was here, she said. He was working, Cora said quietly. Ruth looked up the trail. He was building, she said. Let's go see what. The granite pillar was exactly where the map said it would be, a column of pale rock standing apart from the ridge wall, like a sentinel someone had set there on purpose. They turned left, and the trail disappeared almost immediately into loose rock and scrub pine, just as their father had written. Cora navigated with the map open in her hands, calling directions to Ruth, who led them through the thinning trees. The wall appeared gradually. At first, it read as just another face of the ridge, gray granite striped with old watermarks, tufted at the base with dead grass. Then Ruth saw it, a vertical shadow that didn't behave like shadow, a darkness that stayed dark even as the morning light shifted around it. The crack was exactly as she had imagined it, and nothing like she had imagined it. It was narrow, perhaps 18 inches at its widest, and it ran from the ground up to a height of about 8 feet before the stone closed again above. The edges were worn smooth in a way that the rest of the wall was not. Someone had used this passage often enough to polish the stone. Papa, Nell breathed. Ruth set down her pack and leaned into the opening. Cool air pushed against her face from inside, not the cold of an empty cave, but something more temperate, like the air inside a root cellar in autumn. She could see nothing past the first few feet. She picked up her pack and turned sideways and went in. The passage was perhaps 12 feet long, She moved through it with her pack scraping both walls, her boots finding solid footing on a floor that had been partially leveled with laid stones. Her father's work, she realized, glancing down at the deliberate placement. He had leveled the path. He had thought about this. And then the passage opened. She had expected a cave. What she stepped into was a chamber, roughly oval, perhaps 40 feet across at its widest and 30 deep, with a ceiling that rose in a natural arch to perhaps 20 feet at the center. The walls were granite, irregular but not jagged, and thin fissures in the ceiling admitted shafts of pale morning light that fell in angled columns across the stone floor. The light was cool and blue-white and moved slightly as clouds passed outside. Against the far wall stood the cabin. It was small, perhaps 16 by 14 feet, built directly against the stone, using the chamber wall as its back wall. The timber was hand-cut and fitted with visible care, the kind of joinery that took time and attention. The roof was split shingles, slightly mossy at the edges. A wooden door hung slightly ajar on iron hinges. A single window opening, shuttered from inside, faced the chamber floor. Ruth stood very still. Behind her, she heard Cora's breath catch as she came through the passage, and then Nell's small sound. Not quite a word, not quite a cry. "He built a house," Nell said, "inside the mountain." Ruth walked to the cabin and put her hand on the doorframe. The wood was dry and solid. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was one room, a plank floor, a small iron stove with its pipe running up through a gap in the roof shingles, a wooden shelf along one wall, a sleeping platform built into the corner, and a small table with 2 chairs. Everything was dusty, unused for the months since their father had last been here, but intact. A tin cup sat on the table. A folded piece of cloth lay on the shelf. She picked up the cloth. It was a curtain, she realized, cut and hemmed for the window, never hung. Cora appeared in the doorway behind her, then Nell, who stopped on the threshold and pressed both hands to her mouth and stood there looking at the cup on the table and the curtain in Ruth's hands and the careful plank floor her father had laid down in the dark of a mountain chamber for daughters he would not live to see arrive. They cried. There was no managing it, and none of them tried. Nell sat down on the sleeping platform and put her face in her hands and cried the way she had cried when their father died, completely, without holding anything back. Cora stood in the center of the room and let tears run down her face without wiping them, her journal clutched against her chest. Ruth stood by the window and pressed her knuckles against her lips and looked at the curtain in her hand until she could breathe again. Then they got to work. Ruth had been raised to understand that the best thing to do with grief was to move it into your hands. Her mother had said that once, and she had not understood it then either. She understood it now. She shook the curtain out, found 2 small nails already placed at the window frame. Her father had thought of this, and hung it. Cora opened the shelf and began cataloging what was stored there. A wrapped paper of salt, a tin of lard gone stiff with age, dried herbs bundled with cord, 3 folded Hessian sacks, a small box of candles. Not nothing. A start. Nell discovered the water. She had followed the sound before the others noticed there was a sound. A low, steady dripping that came from the left side of the chamber beyond the cabin wall. She came back and pulled at Ruth's sleeve without speaking, and led them both out and around the cabin's outer corner to where a natural shelf of stone jutted from the chamber wall. Above it, a seam in the granite ran with a slow, thin trickle of water that collected in a carved stone basin. Not natural, Ruth saw immediately. The edges were too regular. Someone had worked this stone. The water was warm. Nell touched it first, then looked up with an expression that Ruth would remember for the rest of her life. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation of something she had suspected the world might be capable of. "Warm water," Cora said, crouching over the basin. "There must be a thermal seam." He found it and shaped the basin to catch it. She looked at the stone. "He worked this himself. Look at the chisel marks." Ruth looked at the marks. Small, deliberate, patient work in the dark. She thought about all the times her father had disappeared into the hills, and she had not asked where he was going. She thought about what kind of love builds something in secret for years without being able to talk about it. "There's soil," Nell said. She was moving along the chamber wall, past the water basin, to where the warm trickle had found its way along the base of the stone over years and left a band of dark, damp earth perhaps 18 inches wide and running for nearly 20 feet along the wall. Nell crouched and pressed her hand into it. "It's good soil," she said. "Warm." She looked back at her sisters. She was already reaching for the tin in her coat pocket, their mother's seeds. "Not yet," Ruth said, but gently. "First we make the cabin livable, then we plant." They worked all that day and into the afternoon with the columned light shifting overhead as the sun moved outside. They swept the cabin floor with a pine bough until Ruth could cut a proper broom from the scrub growth inside the passage entrance. They unstoppered the stove and found it sound, and Ruth laid a careful fire with wood their father had stacked dry against the chamber wall. Enough for several weeks, she estimated. The smoke rose through the pipe and disappeared into the fissure above. Cora redirected the water flow with a wedge of flat stone, slowing the overflow and directing it to a second, lower shelf where it could collect for washing. She was precise about it, working the stone with a patience that reminded Ruth of their father. By evening the cabin was warm. The curtain hung. The shelves held their goods. 3 bedrolls lay on the sleeping platform. Outside in the chamber, the mineral water dripped steadily into its basin, and the warm, damp earth waited along the wall. That night, after supper, Cora opened her journal and began writing. Nell fell asleep quickly, her hand still faintly soil-dark. Ruth sat by the stove and listened to the mountain around them, the faint settling of stone, the distant wind that could not reach them here, the small sounds of water. She thought, "We are safe. Not permanently. Not without work. Not without the world pressing in eventually. But tonight, in this room their father had built inside a mountain, with her sisters breathing quietly on either side of her, she understood what he had been trying to give them. Not just shelter, a position from which to begin. The danger came from the direction of a man named Harlan Good. Good held land in the valley below the ridge and fancied himself an authority on what belonged to whom in that corner of the territory. He was not dishonest exactly. He operated within the bounds of what he could make legitimate. But he had an appetite for land that outran his actual holdings, and he had been quietly acquiring parcels from families who ran out of time and money. He had looked at Jonas Vance's claim twice while Jonas was alive, and been told twice that it wasn't for sale. He had attended Jonas Vance's burial with an expression of concern that Ruth had not trusted then, and understood better now. The land claim was real. Their father had filed it years ago, under a description that was deliberately vague. Mineral and timber rights, northeastern granite ridge, survey pending. No cabin mentioned, no chamber described. The survey had never been completed, which meant the claim existed in the kind of legal ambiguity that men like Harlan Good were skilled at navigating. Cora had found the claim papers in the bottom of their father's letter, tucked behind the map. She had laid them on the table and studied them for a long time before she spoke. "He filed this in 1881, she said. 8 years ago, before we were old enough to know what it meant." "He was already planning," Ruth said. "He was already afraid something might happen," Cora said. "That's different." Nell had been watching their faces. "What does it mean for us?" "It means the land is ours," Ruth said, "as long as we can prove occupancy and maintain the claim." "And if someone challenges it?" Ruth didn't answer because 2 days later, she heard footsteps on the granite above the chamber. She was outside the passage entrance. They always kept it concealed with a repositioned boulder that could be rolled from inside, gathering pine needles for the floor when she heard it. The deliberate crunch of boots on loose rock, methodical, searching. She stood still and pressed herself against the wall and listened. The steps came along the ridge face, paused, moved on. She counted her breaths. After some minutes, the steps receded downhill. That evening, she told her sisters. Cora was quiet for a moment, then, "How close to the entrance?" 20 feet, maybe less." "Did they see you?" "I don't believe so. I was in the shadow of the wall." Nell looked at the boulder concealing the passage. "Can we make it better? The disguise?" Ruth had been thinking about this since she'd heard the footsteps. "We need to dress the entrance properly, scatter the area, move the loose soil. Make it look like nobody has gone near that section of wall in years." Cora looked at the map, then at the claim papers. "We need to register our occupancy before Good makes any kind of move. The land office in town, if we can get someone to notarize our presence here and date it." "We can't go into town and draw attention to where we are," Ruth said. "No, but I can write a letter." Cora's expression was the one she got when she had already solved a problem and was only now telling the others. "There's a circuit lawyer who comes through Elk Hollow every 2 months. Papa used him once for timber work. I have his name. If I write to him through the postal agent in the next valley, not Elk Hollow, we stay invisible here while the claim gets properly recorded." Ruth looked at her sister. "When did you think of this?" "About 3 minutes after you told us about the footsteps," Cora said. The letter went out with a trapper named Devers, who passed through the valley every 10 days and had no particular loyalty to anyone in Elk Hollow. Cora paid him with a jar of the pickled herbs she had found in her father's stores. He seemed more pleased with that than he would have been with coin, which Ruth filed away as useful. They waited. And while they waited, the world outside continued its slow pressure. A boy from town appeared on the lower trail 3 days after the letter was sent. He was perhaps 12, clearly not searching deliberately, but wandering in the way that boys do when they've been pointed in a direction by an adult and told to see what's there. Ruth watched him from above, behind a screen of pine boughs, as he walked the base of the ridge, looked at the granite wall with the incurious gaze of a child doing an errand he didn't understand, and eventually turned back downhill. She was not fooled by his incuriousness. Good was testing the territory the way he did everything, indirectly, through others, at a distance that kept him clean of any direct accusation. She had grown up watching men like him operate. They never came themselves until they were certain. Cora wrote a second letter after that, this one to the land office directly, enclosing a copy of their father's original claim and a brief statement of occupancy signed by all 3 of them, dated and specific. She addressed it in a hand that was careful and formal and nothing like her ordinary writing, a small precaution. Ruth watched her do it and thought of their mother, who had understood that survival required a kind of daily intelligence that men in comfortable positions never had to develop. Inside the chamber, meanwhile, Nell had begun to plant. She had prepared the soil along the warm wall with the patience of someone who had watched their mother garden for 16 years. She soaked the damp earth further with water drawn from the basin, worked in wood ash from the stove, and planted the seeds from their mother's tin in careful rows pressed into the earth with her forefinger. Radishes, hardy greens, a hardy variety of kitchen herb their mother had grown for years. She marked each row with a small flat stone and a nick in the stone to indicate what was planted. Ruth watched her work and felt something shift in her chest. Not grief this time, but something like it from the opposite direction, like a space refilling. When the tension was at its highest, 3 weeks in, no word from the lawyer, and a rumor carried back by Devers that Good had been asking after the Vance girl's whereabouts in town, Ruth made a decision. She went back to Elk Hollow herself. She went alone, in the early morning, dressed plainly, and she went directly to the general store where the postmaster kept a box. She collected one letter from the circuit lawyer, as it turned out, and she bought a small sack of cornmeal and a coil of wire without speaking to anyone except the storekeeper, who asked where she was staying. "With family," she said, which was true. She was back at the passage entrance by mid-afternoon. She handed the letter to Cora without a word. Cora opened it, read it, and looked up with an expression that Ruth had not seen on her sister's face in over a year. "He's filed it," Cora said. "The claim is recorded in all 3 of our names, dated 3 weeks ago. It predates anything Good might try." The mountain was quiet around them. Somewhere inside, Nell's seeds were beginning their work in the warm, dark earth. The morning after, Devers came up the lower trail himself, something he had never done, and called Ruth's name from below. She went down to him alone. His expression was different than she had seen it before. He held his hat in his hands. "Miss Vance," he said, "I don't want any trouble with this. But Good has been around to see me. He knows you're up in the ridge somewhere. He don't know exactly where, but he knows you got a letter from a lawyer, and he's put it together." Ruth stood very still. "He's coming up tomorrow," Devers said. "First light." Ruth walked back up the mountain slowly, working out what she felt. Not panic. She was not built for panic. But something close to despair, the particular kind that comes not from a single blow, but from the accumulated weight of losses that have come one after another until the load seems designed to be uncarryable. She had lost her mother, her father, her home in town, and now the home her father had built them, the one thing he had managed to prepare for them against exactly this kind of loss, was at risk of being taken by a man who saw the world as a ledger, and them as nothing but an unclaimed balance. She sat inside the passage, in the narrow dark between the wall of the mountain and the chamber, and put her back against the stone. Her father had worked in this stone. His hands had shaped the basin. His saw had cut the planks. He had carried all of it through this passage, piece by piece, in the years when he had understood that the world could become what it had become. She pressed her palms flat against the granite. He had known this place would need defending as much as building. He had given them the tools to do both. Ruth stood up and went inside to tell her sisters. Cora listened to the whole account without interrupting, then sat with her hands folded on the table for a long moment. "We don't hide," she said. "We receive him." Ruth looked at her. "We have a recorded claim, dated and filed. We have legal occupancy. We have documentation." Cora touched her journal. "And we have the chamber itself, which no claim description can adequately describe, and which nobody will be able to dispute once they've stood inside it and seen what Papa built." You want to show him? Nell said. I want to show him everything, Cora said. They prepared the chamber the way their mother had prepared for company, thoroughly, with care, and without apology. Ruth swept the cabin floor again and straightened the shelves. She checked the fire in the small stove and let it breathe down to a steady, civilized warmth. She hung the second cloth their father had left folded on the shelf, a piece of heavy canvas, along the passage entrance from the inside, so that when it was pulled aside, it revealed the cabin in a frame of stone and light. Cora laid the claim papers, the lawyer's letter, and the original survey on the table in a neat column, with dates visible and signatures forward. She did not dramatize the arrangement. She simply made it clear. Nell, without being asked, spent the morning before Good's arrival tending the growing wall. In the 3 weeks since she'd planted, the first shoots had appeared, pale green, insistent, impossibly cheerful in the stone chamber's cool blue light. She watered them from the basin. She removed a few small stones that had fallen. When she finished, she came inside and washed her hands and sat at the table with her sisters. Harlan Good arrived at the ridge with a man Ruth didn't recognize, a kind of legal-adjacent figure, she thought, a recorder or a witness or simply a person Good brought along to seem more substantial. He called her name from the boulder and she went down and stood in front of him in the cold morning air. He was a large man, florid and confident in his boots. He had the particular bearing of someone who had rarely been told no by anyone who couldn't afford to lose something. Miss Vance, he said pleasantly, I understand you've been settled up here somewhere. I wonder if you might show me the extent of your father's claim. I'd be happy to, Ruth said. She saw something flicker in his expression. He had expected resistance, and its absence threw him slightly. She let it throw him. She led him and his companion to the entrance and rolled the concealing boulder aside with a practiced motion that she hoped communicated. I have done this every day. This is mine. She took them through the passage. She had debated with herself whether to let him see the chamber at all. But Cora had been right. The surest way to defend something real was to make it visible. Legal claims could be argued. What her father had built inside that mountain could not be argued with. It was simply there, undeniable, patient, already complete. Good stepped out of the passage and stopped. Ruth watched him look at the chamber. She watched him take in the columns of light from the ceiling fissures, the cabin against the far wall with its tin pipe rising to the smoke seam above, the stone basin with its steady trickle of warm water, and the long green band of growing things along the warm wall. Nell's careful rows, their mother's seeds, already several inches tall in the dark, rich earth. He stood there for a long time. His companion, the recorder, or whatever he was, had gone very quiet. Cora came to the cabin doorway with the documents in her hands. She walked across the chamber floor, unhurried, and offered them to Good. The filed claim and the occupancy registration, she said, dated 6 weeks prior to your inquiry, I believe. All 3 of us are named as holders. The circuit lawyer's certification is on the 2nd page. Good took the papers. He read them with the expression of a man who had been hoping for a different document and found himself holding the correct one. Your father filed this in 1881, he said. Yes, Cora said. He was thorough. Good looked at the cabin again. He walked to the water basin and looked at the chisel marks around it without touching anything. He looked at the plank floor through the cabin doorway and the careful joinery of the walls. Ruth watched him understand, slowly, what he was looking at. Not a rough encampment, not a temporary shelter, but years of deliberate, patient, loving construction. Something that could not be dismissed or absorbed or purchased out from under them because it was too specific, too built, too much the product of a particular man's particular love. He handed the papers back to Cora. "The claim appears to be in order," he said. There was nothing more in his tone, no apology, no warmth, but also no argument. He and his companion left the way they had come. Ruth stood at the passage entrance and watched them until they were below the tree line. Then she rolled the boulder back into place, and the mountain was quiet again. She turned around. Nell was sitting cross-legged on the chamber floor in front of her growing wall, pulling a single small weed from between two rows with the focused attention of someone doing important work. Cora was back at the cabin doorway, writing in her journal with the claim papers folded neatly beside her on the step. The water dripped steadily. The light came through the fissures above in its patient columns. Ruth crossed the chamber and sat down beside Nell on the cool stone floor and looked at the rows of green in the warm, dark earth. Radishes, hardy greens, their mother's herbs, which smelled, when crushed between the fingers, of every kitchen they had ever stood in together. "They're going to do well," Nell said. She said it with the confidence of someone who had decided to believe it. "Yes," Ruth said, "they are." She leaned back against the stone wall, her father's wall, her home, her mountain, and let the silence of the chamber settle around her like something long prepared. The crack in the granite wall looks from the outside like nothing. A shadow in the rock face. A place where the mountain made a small mistake. A person could walk the ridge 100 times and never stop to look twice. Inside, a fire burns in a small iron stove. Warm water moves steadily into a stone basin. Along the far wall, 3 rows of green reach upward into the blue-white light that falls from the fissures above. 3 young women are doing ordinary things in an extraordinary place, eating, writing, tending, and they are entirely safe, and the mountain keeps its secret, and the world outside does not know where to look.
Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. It genuinely means everything to me. I hope the story kept you company and carried you somewhere new for a little while. If you enjoyed it, please consider giving the video a hype and dropping a comment below letting me know where in the world you're watching from. I always love reading those, and it never stops amazing me how far these stories travel. If this is your first time here, welcome. There are plenty more stories waiting for you on the channel, so feel free to explore. And if you've been here before, thank you for coming back. It means more than you know. Sharing the video with a friend who loves a good story is a wonderful way to support the channel too. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourself.